A senior archivist at Buckingham Palace noticed that Princess Anne had, over the previous 3 months, made 6 private visits to the royal archives without a scheduled appointment. Each visit had lasted between 40 minutes and 2 hours. Each visit had involved a small folder that the Princess Royal had carried in personally and taken away with her at the end. The archivist did not comment. She only noted each visit in the private register and continued her work. She had worked at the Royal Archives for 19 years, and she knew that the Princess Royal never visited the archives without a reason. Princess Anne finished the document on a Tuesday morning. The Princess Royal read the final wording once. Anne set the pages down, and Anne signed her name at the bottom of the account. The document was Anne's personal recollection of a specific private moment she had witnessed inside the king's private study almost 2 years earlier. The moment involved a letter from Princess Diana, written to Prince William before her death, that Charles had held privately for more than 2 decades. And the moment included specific words Charles had spoken to William before he had made the final decision that would shape the coming succession. Anne had held the recollection privately since the day of the meeting. Now the Princess Royal was preparing to reveal, in careful institutional detail, what King Charles had told William before his final decision. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not move from the desk for almost half an hour after signing the account. The Princess Royal read the wording one final time, folded the pages carefully, and placed them inside a plain manila folder. Anne felt no doubt. She had thought about the account for 18 months. Now, holding the final document, Anne felt only the quiet resolve of someone who had waited for the right moment. A personal recollection for the Royal Archive, in plain words, is a written first-person account by a member of the royal family, describing a specific moment they witnessed, meant to be placed into the family's historical record for the benefit of future generations. The account carries the weight of the individual's own signature and can be sealed for a specified period before being made available for wider review. This one had been prepared over 3 months in 6 separate private sessions at the archive and would be sealed for 50 years from the date of Anne's signature. The Royal Archives themselves are held at Windsor Castle in a series of climate-controlled rooms that have been used to preserve the family's institutional memory for more than a century. The Royal Archives, in plain words, are the formal record of the Crown, containing letters, journals, ceremonial documents, and private accounts from every generation of the family since the reign of Queen Victoria. Anne's account would join a small number of first-person recollections that had been placed under seal by senior royals across the generations, some of which had already been released, and many of which remained sealed still. The account was 6 pages long. Its title, written in Anne's own hand at the top of the first page, was "A Meeting in the King's Private Study." Its subject was a specific afternoon nearly 2 years earlier, when Anne had been asked by Charles to be present, quietly and without any recording aid, for a conversation Charles wished to have with William before finalizing his own thinking about the succession. Anne had accepted the request. She had sat in a small chair against the far wall of the study, and she had witnessed a moment that had, from that afternoon forward, changed her own understanding of what her brother had been preparing to do. Sophie learned of the finalized account that morning. The trusted confidant did not ask what the account contained. Sophie only accepted with quiet care that Anne had asked her to be a witness to the sealing of the folder. Sophie sat beside Anne at the desk as Anne placed the 6 pages inside a small archival envelope. She did not read a word. She only watched as Anne wrote the sealing date and the 50-year restriction across the outside of the envelope. Catherine learned of the account by mid-morning. The princess did not raise her voice. She did not ask what was in the 6 pages. Catherine only sat with Anne for a short moment, held her hand briefly, and told her sister-in-law that she was grateful the recollection would exist in the archive. Anne received the words carefully. She had not expected Catherine to know before William, but Catherine had noticed Anne's quiet visits to the archives over the previous 3 months, and had understood, without asking, that something meaningful was being placed on the record. William learned of the account by late morning. The prince did not read the 6 pages. He did not ask to read them. William only sat with Anne inside a small, quiet drawing room off the palace's main corridor and let his aunt tell him in her own words what she had chosen to record. Anne spoke for almost 40 minutes. William did not interrupt. When Anne finished, the prince did not speak for a long time. He only nodded once, quietly, and thanked her. Charles was told of the account that afternoon. The king was inside his private study when Anne arrived without an announced appointment. Anne handed Charles a single sealed page, describing the account in the briefest possible terms, and told him that the 6 pages themselves had already been placed in the archive. Charles read the description twice, and Charles said only one thing to Anne. He said that he had wondered over the previous year whether she might do this. He had hoped she would. He had not asked, and he was grateful. The 4 reactions moved through the palace in a slow, spreading current. Anne felt clarity first, then quiet completion, then the same disciplined care she had brought to every private task inside the family for her whole life. Charles felt gratitude first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a monarch whose sister had, at last, protected a moment that no other person could have protected in the same way. William felt weight first, then love, then the calm resolve of a man who had accepted that Diana's presence in his life would be carried forward by more than just his own memory. Catherine felt tenderness first, then protectiveness, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood at an important edge. But the story behind Anne's account was longer than anyone Tuesday morning, and to understand what she had chosen to record, the story had to move backward. This did not begin with a folder in the archive. It began almost 30 years earlier, in the summer of 1997, in the months after Princess Diana had realized that she wanted to leave something written for her elder son to be given at a specific future moment. Diana had been thinking, in the final months before her death, about the years ahead. She had known, with the intuition that many mothers carry about their children, that William would one day stand at a specific edge of responsibility that she might not be alive to witness. She had not spoken about this feeling to her closest friends. She had not spoken about it to her staff, but Diana had, quietly and privately, sat down one evening in her private apartment at Kensington Palace and written a letter. The letter had been written by hand, in Diana's own careful script, on plain paper that carried no royal letterhead. Diana had written the letter over the course of a single evening, had folded it into a plain white envelope, and had sealed the envelope with the small red seal she kept for personal correspondence. She had written William's name across the front of the envelope, with no address, no title, no formal decoration, only her son's given name, in her own hand. Diana had then done something unusual. She had asked Charles, in a private conversation shortly after finishing the letter, whether he would agree to hold the envelope for her, on the condition that it never be opened by anyone, and that it be given to William at a specific future moment. Charles had asked gently what moment she had in mind. Diana had answered honestly. She had said that she did not know which moment. She had only known that Charles would recognize it when it arrived. Charles had listened. He had thought about the request for a long moment, and Charles had agreed. According to a documented account later prepared for senior aides, Diana had given the envelope to Charles the following morning, in a small, unobserved exchange during a private breakfast at Kensington Palace. Charles had accepted the envelope. He had placed it inside a small locked drawer in his own private safe, and Charles had, from that morning forward, held Diana's letter without opening it, without discussing it with any person outside the household, and without allowing anyone else to see it. Diana had died 3 months later. The envelope had remained inside Charles's private safe. For years afterward, Charles had thought about the envelope only occasionally, on specific days when a memory would surface. A birthday, an anniversary, a small ordinary moment when he would remember something Diana had said. But Charles had never, at any point across nearly 3 decades, considered opening the envelope himself. He had held it exactly as Diana had asked him to hold it. The moment Diana had described had, in Charles's mind, waited across many decades. Charles had thought at various points that the moment might be William's coming of age. It had not felt right at that time. Charles had thought later that the moment might be William's engagement. It had not felt right then either. Charles had thought, later still, that the moment might be William's marriage to Catherine. It had not felt right at that time. Charles had thought, at one further point, that the moment might be William's ascension to Prince of Wales after Charles himself had ascended to the throne. It had not felt right then either. The moment had, in Charles's understanding, arrived only in the year before his own final decision about the transition. Charles had felt, for the first time in almost 3 decades, that the moment Diana had described had begun to take a specific shape. He had prepared to give William the letter privately, at a specific afternoon, in a specific study, with only one witness present. Anne had been that witness. Charles had asked his sister, gently and with care, whether she would agree to be present. He had told her only that he wished her to be there for a conversation that would carry more meaning than he could describe in advance. Anne had accepted without asking any question. She had understood from the way Charles had asked that this was not a conversation Charles could carry alone. According to a private palace briefing prepared for the senior household in the months that followed the meeting, Anne had prepared herself for the afternoon with the same quiet discipline she brought to every private matter inside the family. She had cleared her afternoon schedule. She had asked Sophie to keep the corridor near the king's study private for the duration, and she had arrived at Buckingham Palace an hour before the scheduled meeting, so that she could sit quietly with her brother before William arrived. William had arrived at the scheduled time. He had entered the study without knowing what the meeting would carry. He had known only that Charles had asked him for a private conversation and that Anne would be present. Charles had greeted William quietly. He had asked William to sit in the chair opposite his desk. He had taken from the small locked drawer inside his private safe an envelope that he had held for almost 3 decades, and Charles had placed the envelope on the desk between them. Anne had watched from the small chair against the far wall. She had not spoken. She had not moved. She had only watched, in the same steady silence she had carried her whole life, as Charles had explained to William what the envelope contained, who had written it, and when. The moment before Charles had passed the envelope to William was the moment Anne had, more than any other, chosen to record. Because in that moment, Charles had said to William something that Anne had, from that afternoon forward, held privately inside her for 2 full years. That was why the story had reached this specific Tuesday morning. Not because any single event had forced the recording, not because any single family conversation had triggered it, but because Anne had understood over the previous 2 years that the words Charles had spoken to William before giving him Diana's letter deserved to be preserved for the family that would exist in 50 years' time. And once Anne had signed the account, the story had no choice but to return to the present. Anne asked for a small family gathering at Buckingham Palace on Wednesday evening. The Princess Royal did not use the formal channel. Anne asked quietly for Charles, William, and Catherine to arrive at her own private study, and for no aides to be present inside the room. Anne had also asked that Sophie be present, quietly, so that a witness outside the immediate family would be able to remember the room's mood if it ever needed to be recalled. A private family gathering, in plain words, is a small unofficial meeting held between close members of the royal family without any staff involvement. This one was among the quietest the family had ever called. Charles arrived first. The king did not speak as he waited. William and Catherine arrived together. William did not sit down immediately. He stood near the window, looking out at the palace gardens. Catherine stood close to him, her hand resting quietly against his sleeve. Sophie arrived last and took a chair against the far wall of the study, without speaking. Anne remained at her desk, holding the sealed archival envelope in her lap. Anne did not open with any introduction. The Princess Royal simply held up the sealed envelope so that everyone in the room could see it. She then explained in careful and unemotional language what the envelope contained. 6 pages, a first-person account, a specific afternoon nearly 2 years earlier, a conversation between Charles and William, and the words Charles had spoken to William before giving him a letter that had waited for almost 3 decades. Anne told the room that the envelope had been placed in the archive that morning and would remain sealed for 50 years from the signing date. She said that no one in the room would ever read the 6 pages themselves, but she wished that evening to tell each of them in her own voice what she had chosen to record. Charles nodded once. The king did not object. He had known from the moment he had asked Anne to be present at the meeting 2 years earlier that Anne might one day choose to place the moment on the record. He had trusted her judgment about whether and when, and her judgment that evening was arriving carefully. William stepped away from the window and sat down in a chair opposite Anne's desk. Catherine remained standing, moving only to place her hand gently on William's shoulder. Sophie sat quietly and did not move. Anne spoke slowly. The Princess Royal described in her own careful words what she had watched Charles do that afternoon 2 years earlier. She described the small locked drawer that had held Diana's envelope for almost 3 decades. She described the way Charles had placed the envelope on the desk between them. She described the way William had recognized his mother's handwriting on the front of the envelope and had felt the weight of what he was about to receive before Charles had spoken a single word. Then Anne described the moment Charles had spoken. She did not quote Charles at length. She did not attempt to reconstruct the full conversation. She only shared, quietly, the single sentence that had passed between Charles and William before Charles had given William the letter, the sentence that Anne had, from that afternoon forward, carried privately for 2 years. Anne said the sentence aloud, once. Charles had said to William, "Your mother knew this day would come. She trusted you." The words were short. The words were exact. And the words landed in the room with a weight that no signature could match. Anne had spoken them the way Charles had spoken them, without adornment, without emphasis, without any attempt to make them larger than they had been in the actual moment. And in speaking them, Anne had preserved the moment in a way that no formal document could have preserved. William did not speak for a long time. The prince felt the weight of hearing his own memory said back to him by someone who had watched him receive it. He had lived with those 2 sentences privately for 2 years. He had thought about them almost every day, and now, hearing his aunt speak them, he understood that his mother's foresight had been witnessed. Diana's careful preparation had not been carried by him alone. It had been carried by Charles, it had been carried by Anne, and in a real sense, it had been carried by the family across generations. Then Catherine spoke. The princess did not stand any straighter. She did not raise her voice. Catherine simply looked at Anne across the desk, then at Charles, then at William beside her, and said the line that would carry through the rest of the evening. "In that room Diana was more present than any of us." The words were short, the words were exact, and the words landed with the same quiet weight that Anne's account had already carried. Catherine had not defended anything. She had not praised anyone. She had only named what everyone in the room had already begun to understand. Diana's foresight had, at last, been recorded in a form that would outlive every person currently in the room, and had been placed inside a family archive where a future generation would encounter it as an act of love rather than as a piece of institutional history. Anne felt clarity first, then quiet completion, then the same disciplined care she had brought to the whole story. Charles felt gratitude first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a monarch whose sister had honored a moment he could not have honored alone. William felt love first, then honor, then the resolve of a man who had at last understood that his mother's presence was not something he needed to carry alone. Catherine felt tenderness first, then love, then the same steady care she always carried beside her husband. Anne closed the meeting quietly. The Princess Royal placed the sealed archival envelope inside her desk drawer, locked it, and looked at each person in the room in turn. She thanked them quietly for being present, and she reminded them that no one would read the 6 pages themselves. The account was for a family 50 years in the future. It would be enough that this evening's small circle knew that the moment had been preserved. William walked with Charles through the private gardens at Buckingham Palace the following morning. The 2 of them did not carry aids. They did not carry any paperwork. Charles had asked quietly whether William might spend an hour with him among the gardens, and William had agreed without needing to think about it. The two men walked slowly along the same gravel path that Charles had walked with William the year before, in the days after Charles had made his final decision about the transition. Neither of them mentioned Anne's account directly. They did not need to. Both of them had, from the previous evening's meeting, understood that the moment had passed into a form that would carry itself forward. Charles spoke first. The king did not raise his voice. He told William that he had wondered, in the days after giving William the letter almost 2 years earlier, whether he should have done anything differently. He had wondered whether he should have told William sooner. He had wondered whether he should have told William that Anne was going to be present. He had wondered whether he should have given the letter privately, without any witness at all. But Charles told William that he had come, at last, to believe that Anne's presence had been right. She had witnessed a moment that only Anne could have witnessed with the right kind of care, and her recording now had honored that. William listened. The prince did not interrupt. He only walked beside his father at a slow, steady pace, letting the gravel underfoot punctuate the quiet between the sentences. Then Charles said something William had not expected. The king told his son that Diana had, in one of their last private conversations before her death, told Charles that she was less worried about William's readiness than about William's loneliness. She had known that William would be ready. She had not known whether William would be surrounded by the right people when the moment arrived. She had asked Charles, in that same private conversation, to ensure that William would never carry the weight of the crown alone. Charles had promised. And Charles at last told William that the promise had been kept. Anne was in the archive. Catherine was standing beside him every day. Sophie was carrying the practical arrangements, and the family, as a whole, had held. William did not speak for a long time. The prince felt the weight of his father's words settle into a place inside him that no document could touch. He thought of Diana. He thought of her final months. He thought of everything she had done, quietly and without display, to prepare him for a life she would not live to see. And William understood for the first time in a very long time that his mother's careful preparation had been received not just by him, but by his father, and by his aunt, and by his wife, and by every member of the family who had, in their own way, honored Diana's foresight without ever being asked to. William thanked his father, briefly and quietly, without turning to face him. The two men walked on. Catherine joined them near the end of the walk. The princess did not interrupt the conversation. She only fell into step beside William, on his other side from Charles, and walked with them the last several minutes back toward the palace. Anne visited William at Kensington that afternoon. The Princess Royal did not come to comfort. Anne only came to confirm one small practical detail. She told William that a very short palace note describing the existence of her archived account without describing its contents would be released the following morning. The note would confirm that the Princess Royal had contributed a first-person recollection to the Royal Archive, dated to a moment inside the king's private study almost 2 years earlier, and the note would be released with the family's collective agreement. Anne had not made the decision alone. She had raised the possibility with Charles the previous evening, after the family meeting had ended, and Charles had agreed without hesitation. According to a later documented account prepared for senior aides, Sophie had helped shape the wording of the palace note that afternoon. The trusted confidant had ensured that the note carried substance without revealing anything that Anne had chosen to preserve. Sophie had shown the wording to Catherine first, then to William, then to Charles. Each of them had approved the wording with a nod. The note would be brief. It would be dignified. And it would give the country only what the family had chosen to share. Anne felt clarity first, then quiet completion, then the disciplined care she had brought to every private moment in the family for her whole life. Charles felt gratitude first, then quiet grief, Then the peace of a monarch whose sister had honored a moment across 3 decades of family history. William felt love first, then honor, then the resolve of a man who had, at last, understood how many people had been carrying his mother's foresight without ever being thanked. Catherine felt tenderness first, then protectiveness, then the same steady care she always carried when the family stood beside her husband. Sophie carried the finalized wording to Anne's office later that evening. The trusted confidant did not speak as she delivered it. Sophie only handed the sealed folder to a senior aide and left without waiting. She had done her part, and she would not need to do it again. The palace released the short note the following morning. The wording was brief, the tone was steady, and the signature at the bottom belonged to the Princess Royal. The note confirmed only 3 things. Princess Anne had, over the previous 3 months, prepared a first-person recollection of a specific moment inside the king's private study almost 2 years earlier. The recollection had been placed formally in the royal archive under a 50-year seal, and the account related to the private conversation between the king and the Prince of Wales that had preceded the transition planning announced the previous year. A palace note of this kind, in plain words, is a short official statement issued by the palace to acknowledge that a private historical record has been placed inside the family archive without revealing the contents of the record itself. This one mattered because it was the first time in living memory that the Princess Royal had contributed a personal account to the royal archive under her own name, and because the moment it recorded involved Princess Diana's memory in a form the country had, for years, believed was private. The country did not receive the note with alarm. The country received it with quiet interest. Most viewers had followed the family's transition period with attention, had understood that many private conversations had shaped the previous year's decisions, and had felt, without being told directly, that the family had been carrying something meaningful in the background of the visible events. The note gave shape to what many had already sensed. A major newspaper carried the story under one careful headline that spread across every screen by midday: "The Princess Royal records a moment." A national newspaper headline, in plain words, is the short, bold sentence at the top of a story that shapes how the public will read everything below it. This one mattered because it framed the story not as a scandal, but as a preservation, and that framing shaped everything that followed. A national broadcaster framed the whole moment with one line during a midday bulletin. A national bulletin, in plain words, is a short news update read out at fixed times of day, meant to give the whole country the same version of the story at the same moment. The broadcaster said only this: "For 50 years the family will remember what only the family will read." That sentence traveled quickly. It did not carry alarm. It only named what the palace had confirmed. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered with white flowers, laying them near the gates in soft, careful rows. Kensington mattered because it was tied so closely to Diana's life and to William's own childhood. The flowers made the story feel less like an archival record and more like a country honoring, without prompting, a mother whose memory had shaped the transition years without needing to be named. Older women placed handwritten cards among the stems. Younger visitors stood quietly with phones lowered. No one shouted. No one protested. The silence outside those gates carried its own kind of thanks. Anne appeared briefly outside Buckingham Palace that afternoon. The Princess Royal wore no ceremonial dress. She carried no prepared speech. Anne only paused near the gates, looked steadily at the small press gathering that had been quietly invited, and offered a single short line. "Some moments belong to the family. Some belong to time." The Princess Royal said nothing else. She only turned back toward the palace, and Sophie walked with her, without any conversation between them. By evening, a second broadcaster framed the story with the line that would carry the longest. "This was not a revelation. This was a preservation." That sentence traveled further than the first. It did not humiliate anyone. It did not exalt anyone. It only named what had happened, in language the country could carry home. And inside the palace, the household understood that the story had passed beyond their reach. The public had received the note, and no further explanation would be needed. Anne signed one final document the following morning. The Princess Royal did not summon a large audience. Anne simply sat inside her private study, read the wording twice, and signed. The paper confirmed a new palace protocol. A private palace protocol, in plain words, is an internal royal rule that controls how sensitive family matters are handled behind palace doors. This one mattered because it created, for the first time, a formal mechanism by which senior members of the family could contribute personal recollections to the royal archive under sealed conditions, without the recollections being released during the lifetime of the participants. The new protocol stated that any senior member of the royal family could, at their own initiative, contribute a first-person account to the royal archive, sealed for a defined period between 25 and 100 years. The protocol confirmed that no such account would be opened or reviewed within its sealed period without the direct written agreement of the reigning sovereign, the Prince of Wales, and the Princess Royal of the day. The protocol was, in essence, a mechanism for the family to preserve moments the public did not need to see, but the family would want future generations to remember. Charles signed his own copy the same afternoon. William signed his copy the following day. Catherine signed as an additional witness, and the protocol was placed formally within the archive's internal records the same evening. Camilla had not been asked to contribute to the specific archived account. She had not expected to be. But Camilla had, over the previous year, prepared her own smaller recollection about the transition period, and she asked Anne quietly whether she might contribute her own account under the same sealed protocol. Anne agreed without hesitation. Camilla's account would be added to the archive within the coming month. Sophie carried the finalized protocol to the office of the Lord Chamberlain later that evening. The trusted confidant did not speak as she delivered it. Sophie only handed the sealed folder to a senior aide and left without waiting. She had done her part, and she would not need to do it again. Anne offered the final judgment inside a quiet corridor at Buckingham Palace. The Princess Royal spoke to Charles with the plain, steady tone that had carried the whole story. Anne told her brother that a family's memory was not lightened by writing it down. It was made steadier, and a memory made steadier by writing was one that could survive the loss of every person who had been in the room. Charles nodded. The monarch understood the message. The story reached its final truth inside those words. A family can survive a private conversation. A family cannot survive a private conversation that no one ever thought to record. The monarchy did not weaken that week. The monarchy only demonstrated again that its most important moments carried their weight best when someone in the family had, at last, chosen to preserve them. Anne had revealed what Charles had told William. The palace had confirmed the archived account. But the country had not been given the sentences themselves. The words had remained inside a sealed envelope, waiting for a family 50 years in the future to receive them. And Diana's foresight, at last, had been placed inside a record that would outlive every person who had held it. Anne had revealed what Charles had told William, but Anne had also protected it. And behind the small sealed envelope of a single Tuesday morning, a family had, at last, agreed that certain moments deserved to be preserved for the generations that would need them most. If this story moved you, please take one moment to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next chapter of the royal family's most private struggles. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.